I kept mocking him and made fun of his career, but never thought he would take such brutal revenge.
Hello, Reddit community. How do you make things right after breaking the heart of the one who trusted you most? Because I am sitting here feeling like I've shattered something I can't ever fix. I don't know who to talk to about this, so I'm putting it here and hoping that maybe someone has been through something similar or has any advice to offer. I feel like my heart is torn, and the worst part is knowing I did this to myself. I wish I could take back the words I said, the thoughtless joke that felt like nothing in the moment but has left me in pieces now. I was careless, maybe even cruel, and I didn't realize just how much those words would cost me until it was far too late. Now I can't shake the regret that keeps clawing at me. My name is Lisa, and let's call my husband Tom. We've been married for 8 years now, long enough that you'd think I'd know better. You see, Tom is one of those people who doesn't just do his job. He lives it, and he's proud of it. He's kind, patient, and pours his heart into everything he does, especially for me. And I stay at home, keep our place in order, and have all the time in the world to think about how lucky I am. Or at least, I should have. Because instead of using the time that my husband's hard work allows me to do something useful and productive, I spend it gossiping and chatting. That was my sin, my tongue. And it had been going on for a long time. But it's not my fault. I was just saying what I see. To be honest, when we were dating, and even for the first 3 years of our marriage, Tom worked at a huge media company, but there was a big layoff that caused thousands of company staff to be let go. Sadly, Tom was among those that was let go. That year was a pretty hard one for us. He had to apply for almost 100 jobs, perhaps even more. We had to live off his savings for a long time. Thankfully, he had saved a lot. But then he got a job, not one he wanted, and not one I especially wanted. His friend put in a good word for him, and he got a job at the mine where he spent hours on end. And whenever he came back, he would be so dirty, it was so unbelievable. I know his work was hard, and I know he was just looking out for us, but I was really hoping that his work at the mine would be a temporary thing. But it's been years, and to make matters worse, he took on another job as a commercial truck driver to do during his off days. He was juggling all these very difficult jobs all at once, and while they could take care of us, they all had one thing in common. They were very embarrassing jobs. I used to sit down and ask myself what would happen when we have children and they are asked in school about their father's occupation. What would they say? A truck driver? A mine worker? The mere thought of it is just so embarrassing that it gives me shivers. Oh, I forgot to mention I was an absolutely horrible cook, and Tom was okay with it in the past. He didn't mind coming back and getting into the kitchen to prepare something for us, but after he started working in the mines, he said he didn't have that time, and he needed home-cooked meals whenever he came back. I felt betrayed because I clearly remembered how he told me it was okay that I didn't know how to cook. I even complained to my mother about it, and she told me to bear with him and help him out. Tom suggested that I take cooking classes when he was at work, which was my attempt to be a good wife. And of course, he was the one paying for this. And this was the seed that started our problems. The first day I went there, Tom was going to drop off a truck shipment, and he gave me a ride since we were heading the same way. I will never forget the feeling that rushed through me when he dropped me off and I got out of the vehicle. It was total embarrassment. Once I got out of the vehicle, I saw other women being dropped off by their husbands in nice cars, and their husbands were so cleanly dressed that it made me want to bury Tom in the shadows. That was my Tom in the past, fancy cars given by the company and fancy suits. But when he lost the job, the company took their car away. I was overthinking everything, but that was just the start. I started my cooking classes, but those classes were just for these women to come brag about who their husbands are and the things their husbands buy for them. It was suffocating, and I would lie if not for Tom's I am everywhere presence. It's so unbelievable. One day, when we were done with classes for the day and we were all heading out, I saw Tom standing outside. He was on his way back from the mine and decided to stop and give me a ride. He had bought a pickup truck and was so happy to pick me up. He was dirty, but he didn't mind. He grabbed me and lifted me in the air to show how happy he was. And I wanted to be happy for him, but what I felt was a rush of humiliation and complete shame. All the other wives couldn't stop looking at us, and I swear I felt like burying myself that instant. Thankfully, we got into the car and left, although I won't lie, the car is quite good. But it wasn't as fancy as the ones he used to drive or the ones the husbands of the women at the cooking class came to pick them with. When we got home that day, Tom went to take his bath, which was a rule I made for him since he started working at the mines. I was honestly bitter when I made that rule, but he didn't see it that way. He didn't care what he was going to do as long as it made me happy, and I was happy and comfortable. I cooked a delicious meal for him, and when we were done eating, he made advances at me for the first time in a while. Because of the jobs he does, he was always so tired when he came home, and because of that, we didn't have a lot of intimate moments. Not that I cared, though. I have never been a big fan of intimacy, so I didn't really care. Plus, there was the fact of me not being so attracted to Tom anymore because of how I now viewed him. But that night was great, although when I woke up in the morning, he was gone. I didn't have any cooking classes that day, but something really interesting happened. I got a call from one of the wives from my cooking class inviting me to her house. I was very surprised, but of course, I was happy to go. It beat staying at home alone with nothing to do, so I was definitely jumping at the opportunity. So I dressed up pretty, put on some makeup, and hurried over the address I was given. When I got there, I didn't want to believe that it was her house at first. This place was beautiful. It wasn't very large, but it was so pretty and well furnitured that it took my breath away. Some of the wives from the cooking class were already there. It was quite surprising to see them outside that large kitchen where we have our classes. To be honest, I knew that most of them in my class hung out together, especially because I used to hear them whisper about how a few of their husbands even worked at the same place. But it was just still weird seeing them there. We were just hanging out and talking. But I talked the least because I didn't want to look like I was the least privileged one out of all of them. They spent most of the time talking about the things their husbands got them, and when they were tired of talking, they shifted their attention to me. One of them asked me what my husband does, and I couldn't open my mouth to answer. I was so embarrassed and shocked at the same time. One of them, Vivian, was the one who pulled me out of that sticky situation. She told them that they were just getting to know me and they were already asking personal questions. Thankfully, I didn't need to say anything after that. After that hangout, I went home and prepared dinner. I couldn't stop thinking about everything that happened, about how embarrassed I was to say what my husband does for a living. So when he even came through the doors and greeted me, I didn't answer. I was angry and I didn't even know why. He came to me in the dining room where I was sitting to see if I was okay, because I always answer him when he says hi after coming home. In my head, I had gone through this rigorous argument with him where I asked him to quit his work or at least start looking for another white-collar job in the meantime. But looking at him standing there, I couldn't bring myself to say anything to him. He asked me if everything was fine, but I couldn't answer him. I just told him to go take his bath. He clearly knew I wouldn't let him hold me to comfort me if he's dirty, so he went to take his bath. And when he came back, I had served his food on the table. He held me and asked what the problem was, and I told him that it wasn't a problem he could handle. I pulled myself out of his grasp and left for the room. I went to bed early that day, and by the time I woke up in the morning, he was gone. But I saw a bouquet of flowers at my bedside. To be honest, it made me smile. He was still as thoughtful as ever. I still didn't have a cooking class that day, so I invited some friends over to catch up. I hadn't seen my friends in a while. By midday, all three of them were here. We liked to knit as we talked, so we knitted and talked about everything. I was quiet for most part of the conversations. I kept drifting off in thought, and when one of my friends asked what the problem was, I refused to say. She asked when I started hiding things from them. I didn't want to say anything, I swear, because my mother had always said that couples handle things as a couple and don't let other people get involved. But I was suffocating, and my friends were here offering a way for me to breathe. I needed someone to talk to. Before I knew it, I was crying. They all hurried to my side and asked what the problem was. I told them that I felt like a bad person, but I couldn't hold it back any longer. They said I could let it all out. Before I knew it, my tongue started running. I was so frustrated that I just wanted to offload everything on my chest. I told them I hated the defeatist mentality that Tom had. He had just quit trying to look for a better job. I told them that it was so embarrassing to even say what my husband does in public, and I told them what happened at the house of the cooking class wife's house. I saw a look in their eyes, and I knew they were holding something back. I asked what they were hiding. They said they had talked about it already, that they found it difficult to understand how I could withstand the embarrassment.
All right.
I felt like they could understand where I was coming from. I told them that the day he came to pick me up after buying the pickup truck was the most embarrassing day of my life. They told me that they could understand. One of them told me that if she had to learn how to cook, she might just cut off her hands. We all laughed, but I thought about it. Look at me learning to cook and spending so much time in the kitchen just to keep a man happy. I told them that I was getting frustrated with my life, that the current Tom wasn't the same person I married. I outrightly said that he was the kind of man that we'd see and make fun of, and now I have that man as my husband. My friends sympathized with me. They told me that I have to get my marriage back. I asked them how, and they told me to give him an ultimatum. They told me that if he really cared about him, he'd quit that stupid job that he was using to embarrass me and look for something serious and responsible. I nodded and said that they were right, that his job had taken a toll on me. I was cooking like my life depended on it, and that cleaning nonstop because of how much sand and dirt fell off his body when he came back from the mine. And he was clearly an embarrassment to me. I announced that he had to leave that stupid job, or I would leave because I was drowning in this life. I mentioned how I don't even find him attractive anymore because of his job and the entire situation. I told my friends that I feel nothing but disgust when he tries to touch me because all I can imagine when he touches me is dirt. They laughed, and I laughed as well. I nodded with a stupid smile on my face, and it was like the universe was just against me, because the next thing I heard was the loud sound of a car door banging shut, followed by the car engine starting and revving. I quickly hurried to the window and looked. It was Tom's pickup truck driving off at top speed. I felt my heart rate slow down. I asked myself why he came back to the house in the afternoon. That never happened. But more importantly, I was scared that he had heard everything. My friends told me not to be scared, that he needed to find out, and at least now he had. They told me that I was going to tell him eventually, so what difference does it make if he found out earlier and in the way he did? I told them that they were right and braced myself to properly have that conversation with him that night. That night, I prepared dinner and waited for him to return, but he didn't, and I slept on a couch in the living room while waiting for him. I wanted to address the issue at hand with as much immediacy as I could. He came back early in the morning, and I was lucky enough to wake up as he was coming in. I greeted him, but now he was the one who didn't answer. I quickly grabbed his arm, and he looked back and asked me if he wasn't too dirty for me to be touching him. That alone broke all doubt I had about him hearing me and my friends earlier. I told him that we need to talk, but he told me that he was tired and didn't need to say anything to me. That day, Tom didn't go to work. I was quite surprised, to be honest, because I knew for a fact that he wasn't off that day. But what was more surprising was plumbers and builders that came around later that day. Tom had called them to set up a tiny bathroom just at the back of the house. It was so surprising that it made me go to talk to him, but he wasn't giving me listening ears. For the next week, Tom would leave for work, and when he came home, he'd take his bath in the little bathroom outside before he came inside. And he slept on the couch in the living room. He didn't talk to me, nor did he eat anything I prepared. He didn't eat at home at all. After that first week, I locked every other entrance to the house one early morning before he could wake up. By the time he was ready for work and was ready to leave, I stood in front of the main door and told him to talk to me. He was so indifferent. I couldn't even believe that this person was the same Tom that had left flowers at my bedside just a week ago. He told me to get out of his way, but I refused. He asked what I wanted, and I told him that I just wanted us to talk. He told me that he had nothing to say to me. He said I want him to quit his job, but he has no intention of quitting. He said that I might not know this, but that same job I hate is the same one that has been taking care of us for years now. It's the same jobs that have clothed us, fed us, gotten us a car, and so much more. It's that same job that has allowed us to have savings and allowed me to remain a housewife. But I was too selfish to look past myself to see the good things. He said that we were lucky, that some of his colleagues who were laid off by the company he used to work for are currently homeless, and yet here I am being ungrateful. He said the reason he came back early that day was because he didn't like that I wasn't in a good mood. He thought that I felt neglected, and he was trying to be a good husband but met his wife saying the most horrid things about him. I apologized, and he told me that I didn't even know what I was sorry for. He forced his way past me, and that was the last conversation we had for about 2 weeks. By this time, things were beginning to get finished in the house: food, toiletries, cosmetics, and so on. Tom wasn't eating from the house anymore, so he didn't even care anymore. I tried to tell him that we were running out of things. His only answer to me was that his money was dirty since it was gotten from a dirty job, so I should go find clean money from somewhere else. I'm so annoyed right now. I feel like I don't have a husband anymore, and if he is punishing me, hasn't he gone too far already? I need help on what I should do. Please tell me what I should do. Update. Hi everyone, I'm back here because my life has taken a complete dive down the drain. I was thinking that Tom was just going through a phase and that this phase would soon pass, but that's not the case. He still refused to buy anything in the house, and I was honestly starving. I had some pocket money that he'd given me in the past, and I used it to eat for a few weeks, but I was living like a refugee. I tried borrowing money from my friends, but they didn't even have the money to give me. I begged them to ask their husbands for me, but they told me that they could not stress their husbands with such trivial matters. It was so painful, the way they turned their backs on me like it was nothing. They clearly never had my best interest at heart, because what kind of friends do absolutely nothing to help you when you are starving? I even asked them to bring some food over for me, but they had some excuse that was so stupid for me to even remember. I begged Tom again and again, but he didn't care about anything I had to say. I ran into one of the wives from my cooking class, the one who told the others not to bother me with questions I don't want to answer, and I met her in the most humiliating way. I tried paying for the things I got at the mall, but my card was declined. I didn't have enough money in the account. I felt stranded, and she was in line, so she paid for me. A stranger paid for my food, and my friends couldn't. She gave me a ride, and I guessed she noticed that I felt embarrassed, so she told me that it was completely okay that my card was declined. She said that she knew that my husband worked in the mines because she sees him early every morning with a group of mine workers heading for the mine. She told me that she didn't want to impede my personal life, but she knew that the mine workers are paid well, so she wanted to know if me and my husband were in debt or something. I asked her why she would think we're in debt, and she said that she knew for a fact that my husband would give me everything I needed. She said it was clear to her and everyone at the cooking class that my husband loved me so much, because most men call their friends when they get a new car. But he couldn't even wait for me to come home. He brought it straight to my class. At this point, I burst out in tears, crying inside her car. She was honestly shocked. She pulled over and asked what was wrong. I couldn't control myself. I kept sobbing and crying. I needed someone to rely on, so I told her everything. She patted my back and consoled me. Her advice to me was that I should take some time away from the house, give my husband some space, and hope that he forgives me. It's been too much now, and I haven't heard a single thing from him. Not a call, not even as little as a text. It is as though he has forgotten me, and I keep having the urge to reach out to him. By the way, I moved back to my parents' house. My mother pities me, but my father has given me an earful about how he always knew that my mother spoiled me too much. Looking back now, I know I made a lot of stupid decisions. My actions were senseless, and my reasoning still doesn't make any sense. I lost a great man because of my childishness. I let my friends who do not even have a hold of their own lives dictate what happens in my marriage. It's clear that Tom wants nothing to do with me anymore. I won't be shocked if I wake up to a divorce document tomorrow. Anyhow, I think he's punishing me with the uncertainty, me not knowing what comes next. If this is his revenge, it is killing me. My dad says I talk too much and I rely too much on people with my problems, so I'm trying to stop doing that. In line with that, this will be the last time you guys will hear from me. Goodbye, Reddit. Thanks for all the advice and comments, both good and bad. I wish I could say I knew better. I should have after all these years. But now, all I feel is regret. Hey Reddit, my name is Anna, and I'm 30 years old. I'm here because I feel like I've been living on autopilot, and lately, well, let's just say things have taken an unexpected turn. I've been married to my husband John for 4 years now. John is one of those solid, dependable types. You know, the guy who everyone describes as a rock. He's calm, reliable, always there when I need him, the kind of guy who'll drop everything just to fix a broken faucet or run an errand. Honestly, anyone else would probably call me lucky. And yeah, I know I am. But sometimes, I don't know, it's like he's almost too steady, too predictable. I don't want to sound bitter or anything, and I really do like John a lot. I trust him, and he has never given me any reason to think otherwise. But after some time spent together, what you have is just such a kind of a relationship that is most probably stagnant. Daybreaks or nightfalls doesn't differ much, and I just can predict by going by the routine what he would say or do. That life we've built together still gives me comfort and, yes, complacency, that familiar, everyday mundane. And sometimes I do not know what I have. I'm lacking that special glimmer. You know, that feeling that comes when you have just started something, and the feeling of enjoyment that accompanies the action. And then there's Jacob, our new neighbor. He has only been living there for some time now, a few months at most, but one cannot say that he did not leave his mark. Every room of the house became brighter and happier as soon as Jacob entered the place. He has this loud, hearty, guttural laugh, and he'd make the rounds of any home around the neighborhood when there are parties. John is the opposite of the loud, impulsive, and charming Jacob when he is displeased. He'll say it as it is without thinking twice, and even though some might find him quite crude, I find it rather endearing. I mean, yeah, he tells jokes that are a little off color, but that is what makes him who he is. At first, it was just casual. I mean, Jacob was that person who actually goes around making friends, so there was nothing out of the norm, in my opinion. We were neighbors and would run into each other at community barbecues or block parties, and he'd always be telling a story or a silly joke that made everyone laugh. The times I had left to kill were suddenly the ones I was actually looking forward to more than I would have wanted to admit. He had this kind of spirited, infectious personality that he dwelled within the atmosphere, so for once I could join in having a good laugh. Over time, I noticed I was spending more time around him, not in a planned way or anything, but just, coincidentally. Like, I'd be out getting the mail, and there he'd be, giving me that grin of his and telling me some outrageous thing he'd done that day. And I won't lie, I enjoyed it. It was harmless, right? Just a bit of fun, something to break up the monotony of everyday life. I convinced myself it was just admiration. Jacob was like this rare firework, unpredictable and exciting, something totally different from what I was used to. So here's where things get complicated, Reddit. I don't know when it started exactly, but after a few weeks of having Jacob around, I noticed I was looking forward to running into him more than I should. It wasn't just about him being funny or easy to talk to anymore. There was this feeling, a kind of nervous excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. And the weird part? I found myself actually trying to look nice whenever I knew he'd be around. Like, suddenly I cared about picking out clothes that were a little more flattering or taking an extra 5 minutes to fix my hair just right. It wasn't anything obvious, but I knew what I was doing even if I didn't want to admit it. I said to myself, it was just this stupid thing that young people have in high school, that when one grows up she tends to laugh at. It didn't mean anything. Well, I was married and content, wasn't I? I was not going to ruin everything for a silly neighborhood crush. But I suppose there was a part of me that sensed that pull, that little shiver of anticipation that meant I'd be seeing him soon, and I knew even then that it wasn't entirely innocent. I would delay doing dishes for longer so that I could wait by the mailbox for a little longer, or wait to take out the trash in the evening so I could see him. Looking back, how did I even consider it? Give myself to a man. It's like something from a cheap teenage romance movie, but back then, it was thrilling. And Jacob? Well, he wasn't quite the dunce either. But after some time, I guess he began noticing my excess attention. It wasn't necessarily blatant, just an occasional look, a smile that stayed a second longer than it should. He would glare at me and stare as if he understood what I was thinking of. And each time I wanted to say, "This is wanted, and I am wanted like this for the first time in many years." He would whistle at me and comment, "You look nice today, Anna," or, "Hey, baby, haven't seen you in a while, must be busy." And I would only smile and ignore him, pretending I did not hear the flirting. So outside, I looked and felt peaceful, but inside, a different feeling was churning in me. It suddenly seemed as if I had been released from a haze. It was wrong and I knew it, but I guess a part of me wanted that attention and that thrill that I don't get at home. Despite which I did not like to accept in my mind that I felt desire for Jacob the same way I did not for John for quite some time now. John was solid, confident, but Jacob was passionate combined with energy. Finally, it was like I was attracted to that flame by some kind of mesmeric power, which can bum me, but can't let me go. One evening's events shifted towards the worse. John was gone for a work function, and I was just at home killing time watching a movie before I received a text from Jacob. He will call me and ask to meet him downtown, and the whole purpose of the meeting is a simple drink. My first feeling was to reject the proposal. I can tell you that. Oh well, I did really know that though, didn't I? But before I could convince myself that it was a bad idea, I had already been responding. Sure, why not? It was just a drink. Nothing had to happen. It was totally harmless. At any rate, I kept saying to myself at least all the time. When I arrived, he welcomed me with that broad grin of his, and so we prepared a bottle of wine and sat together on his sofas. I suppose it was like the beginning of a good night, fancying just a couple of people next door and still even attempting to convince myself that there was no harm in what I was doing and that I shouldn't feel guilty at all. And as night progressed and the glasses of wine were emptied, that chemistry between us was hiring. Each giggle, each shift of the eyes seemed to narrow the gap, and I was freely gorge myself on the way he associated me. Eventually, he reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and for a moment I froze. I knew what was happening. I knew I could stop it, that I should stop it, but I didn't. I felt myself leaning in, and before I knew it, we were kissing, that electric, heart-racing kind of kiss that leaves you feeling dizzy. I kept telling myself it was just one moment, one night, something I could leave behind as soon as I walked out his door. But as things escalated, as we let ourselves get lost in that moment, all my thoughts of consequences just faded away. Next morning, I couldn't stop thinking. I looked up at the ceiling and wondered how I arrived where I was. How did I let things get that far? Yet all I wanted was to act as this incident never occurred, and as if I was an entirely different person from how I had felt less than an hour ago. The next morning I got out of bed before he woke up and then stumbled out the door, the only thought running through my head being that if I could go home, then maybe I could just forget the whole thing with him. When I got back, John was still asleep, blissfully unaware of everything. I slipped back into bed, curled up next to him, and tried to tell myself that it was a one-time mistake, something I'd take to my grave. I told myself I could keep this hidden, that no one had to know. After all, it was just one night, right? Just one stupid, reckless night that I could forget if I tried hard enough. But even as I lay there, the weight of it pressed down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Well, here is where things got off the rails, Reddit. They were planning a neighborhood party. You know, the kind where no matter how much you whine and say you don't feel like going, you find yourself being dragged along. Well apart from his usual monotone, John seemed to have actual excitement in his voice. I am not sure if he wanted to socialize during that time, or he simply considered it appropriate to take a break, but he was happy. Meanwhile, I was on edge. The fact that knowing both Jacob and John would be there was enough to tie my stomach in knots. I attempted to shrug it off, walking, eating, and sitting like a normal person, reminding myself that there was no way anyone knew and it was going to be okay. But honestly, I was a wreck. The night started off pretty typical. People were mingling, laughing, drinking, and there was Jacob, of course, holding court like he always did. He's one of those people who naturally gravitates to the center of every group, his loud laugh echoing across the room as he told some story about a bar fight he'd once been in, probably exaggerated, but everyone was lapping it up. I kept sneaking glances at John, trying to gauge his mood. He seemed relaxed, chatting with a few neighbors, and I felt a tiny bit of relief wash over me, thinking maybe this night wouldn't be so bad after all. But then Jacob caught sight of us, and as if by instinct, he made his way over to where John and I were standing. My heart sank. I tried to keep my face neutral, forcing a smile as he launched right into a conversation with John, laughing about some ridiculous thing he'd done earlier in the week. I tried to join in, pretending everything was normal, but the tension was like this unspoken undercurrent between us. Jacob seemed to sense it too, giving me these sly little glances that made my stomach turn. When we were in a few other companies, Jacob somehow decided that it was time to take his teasing to the next level. He was, as you might say, having a good time entertaining everyone with a flourish of words and full-length stories. Then suddenly he locked eyes with John and proclaimed, "If I got half the chance, I'd give her what she's been craving for." He even winked at me, and his look was directed straight into the face, and everyone in the group laughed. In the moment, I laughed more out of nerves than anything else, but the second I looked at John, I realized I'd made a mistake. He wasn't laughing. He just stared at Jacob, his jaw clenched and his face turning this deep shade of red. It was like he was doing everything he could to keep it together, but the hurt and anger in his eyes were unmistakable. I wanted to reach out, to say something to make it all go away, but I froze, rooted to the spot by this overwhelming guilt. John didn't say a word. He just turned and walked away, excusing himself from the group, leaving me standing there with everyone still chuckling over Jacob's joke. I tried to play it off, muttering something about John just needing a breath of fresh air. But inside, I was panicking. What had I done? I knew I should go after him, but part of me was too scared to face the reality that he might already suspect something. This evening, in an attempt to break the ice during dancing, I was looking across the room at John, who sat with a beer, avoiding any eye contact with me. This time I could hear the guilt gnawing at me, though I continued to ignore it and pretend that everything was fine now. Jacob, on the other hand, didn't look the slightest bit disturbed. He was still laughing, joking, not even a hint of regret for the words he uttered that hurt. Or maybe he really didn't intend to apologize at all. On the way home, I could feel the tension between us thickening. John was completely silent, staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension, but he wasn't having it. Every attempt I made was met with a flat, "I'm fine," or "I don't want to talk about it." The silence was unbearable, and I started to feel this creeping dread, like everything was about to come crashing down. In a last-ditch effort, as we were getting to the driveway, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I looked at him and attempted to brazen it off. I retorted, "John, you are not still fuming over the joke he made, are you?" "Jacob's just like that. He doesn't mean anything by it." I wanted him to start laughing and to say that I was right. He had just wanted to prank me, to scare me, but he didn't. He just looked at me, and for the first time I realized there was such a thing as steel in this man's features that has never been there before. He said, "A joke? That's what you think that was? You really think I didn't notice the way he looked at you, the way you looked back?" His voice was calm, but there was this edge to it, like he was barely holding back everything he wanted to say. I tried to brush it off, to downplay the whole thing, but I could see I was only making it worse. "John, you're overreacting," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "You're just being too sensitive. Jacob's a flirt, yes, but it's harmless." But he didn't back down. Instead, he just looked at me, his gaze piercing right through every excuse I was trying to make. "Is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because to me, it looked like there was something more going on there, something you're not telling me." My heart started racing where I attempted to downplay the situation, telling him that he was being ridiculous. I even laughed, thinking, there must be some reason, perhaps he intends on staying forever. But if he sees how foolish he is, he will leave. But he didn't laugh. He just shook his head, and although his face was red with fury, there was pain too, that made me feel nauseous. And then I knew that he would not stop, and that the questions were going to be in my head no matter what. From that point on, things between us changed. John became distant, watching me with this careful, scrutinizing gaze that made me feel like I was always under a microscope. He didn't say anything outright, but every time I so much as mentioned Jacob's name, I'd see that flash of suspicion in his eyes, like he was piecing together a puzzle I desperately wanted to keep hidden. It was like microaggression initially. Someone says something to him, another person rolls their eyes at him, but over time, his paranoia increases. He would just say things like, "You weren't with Jacob today, were you?" Or, "Did you notice Jacob at the party?" in a voice that was far more meaningful than the words he was speaking. I kept trying to make it seem like I really didn't care and that everything was cool, but inside of me, it was like I was on the edge of a precipice waiting for the other shoe to drop. Looking back, I realize how blind I was, how naive. I thought I could keep it hidden, that he'd forget, that we'd just move on like nothing had happened. But every time I saw that look in his eyes, that mixture of doubt and hurt, I knew I was fooling myself. Update. John did not take time to start pointing at me the new look that I have embraced. I was curious and naive and thought that I could just not make any obvious mistakes and just keep my feelings to myself. Even the slightest of signals appeared to engage him if I giggled a little harder at one of Jacob's funny jokes, or if I stopped for a couple of seconds more if our paths crossed. John remained rather quiet, although I could see that in his head he was putting two and two together and the little pieces were accumulating. The feeling of regret for what I had done almost drove me crazy, but I kept telling myself that if I just keep pretending everything is fine, it'll go back to normal. So I reasoned to myself that John was only being paranoid, that he would move on from that comment. But deep down, I knew better. I could tell whenever Jacob was mentioned, the sudden shyness that descended over him, the way he'd observe me with that intense analysis, like I was the only other person in the room. What followed was the day that they came crashing down. On this particular occasion, it was a Saturday afternoon, and John and I had gone for a barbecue party to a neighbor's house. Jacob was there too, not as a quiet and calm man, but as a brilliant, loud man with marvelous charisma, who could even make one spit with laughter. I learned to keep myself on the other part of the yard, hoping John will not look my way or notice me at all. But fate had other plans. Once I even heard Jacob laughing across the yard, and on turning toward him, I realized he was surrounded by a number of people. They were listening much to what Jacob was saying, and he seemed to be quite happy with the kind of attention he was receiving. I could not understand what he was telling everyone, but he just looked towards me, and after saying something that triggered everyone's laughter, a hollow feeling struck my belly. I knew that it wouldn't be easy. It was like a switch flipped. John's face went dark, and he stormed over to where I was standing, his eyes blazing with a mix of hurt and anger. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with a calm intensity that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd yelled. Finally he spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "Anna," he said, "I think it's time you told me the truth." I attempted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as some misinterpretation, but the stare that I received in response told me he didn't believe me. He asked me again, and this time the weight of guilt laid down on my chest and choked me. It became pointless to lie any further. I had to confess and tell him what had occurred, what I had done dancing with Jacob last night. I was even able to see that pain grow in his eyes as I continued to speak, but he simply remained standing there and said nothing. When I was done, I expected him to explode, to scream or yell, to let out all the anger I knew he was holding inside. But instead, his reaction was calm, almost chilling in its intensity. He looked at me with this hollow expression, like he was seeing me for the first time and realizing he didn't know me at all. After a long silence, he simply said, "I'm disappointed in you, Anna. I thought you were better than this." His words hurt me more than I could ever entertain. I could feel the pain of hurting him in my heart. I attempted to say sorry, to justify my actions. However, he raised his hand to terminate our conversation and was nodding negatively. "I've told you once," he added. "I just need time to think." With that, he moved and walked off from me while I was left there feeling so small and shattered within. The drive home was unbearable. John didn't say a word, his face set in that same cold expression, staring out the window as if he couldn't even stand to look at me. I felt trapped in my own guilt. the silence between us growing heavier with every passing minute. I wanted to say something, to tell him how sorry I was, but I knew that no words could undo the damage I'd done. So I stayed quiet, feeling the distance between us widen with each mile. When we got home, I hardly got a response from him, as was our usual interaction before the incident. He walked directly into the bedroom, closing the door on me and leaving me alone with silence. I sat in the living room looking at the walls, thinking of all that had happened in the various moments before, and realizing that I had made a mistake of allowing things to proceed this far. I had that feeling of guilt inside me, and I knew that no matter what I did, things will never be the same again between you and I. In the days that followed, John was cold and distant, keeping to himself and barely speaking to me. When he did talk, his words were clipped and polite, like he was talking to a stranger. I felt the loss of him like a physical ache, this hollow feeling in my chest that refused to go away. I knew I'd hurt him in a way that couldn't be mended with apologies or excuses, and the realization of that was like a knife twisting in my heart. The most incomprehensible thing was that he was not telling me how and what he thought, what he wanted or intended to do. He'd said he needed time, but he hadn't told me what that meant. He'd said he needed time, yes, but he hadn't said what that was for. Was he going to leave me? Was there any remote possibility that we could make out the little life that we had known? It was scary to answer those questions, so I was shocked with the answers I got, but it was me who deserved to be blamed. Having brought things to this point, I knew I had no one else to blame for the aftermath but myself, and proceeded to lie in the bed I had made. I knew I had lost something that cost more than money and can never be bought, and that made me feel so terrible. The only thing I could do was sit there, just waiting for John to make a decision on our little family's fate, realizing all of it was my fault no matter what he chose. Reddit, if I thought it was bad before, I have no idea how worse it can get. It is so cliche thinking that John's anger was the worst punishment. He took things to a whole new level of silent treatment. There was another neighborhood meeting planned, as always allowing neighbors to cook something and letting them chat and gossip over dinner. Frankly, I was looking forward to it, because John and Jacob would be there, and a part of me wished I could simply not attend at all. But John vehemently decided that we should go, and that we couldn't just sit at home all the time. Well, therefore, I had to follow it up, and so I did, albeit unwillingly. The atmosphere was tense the second we arrived. John was calm, polite, greeting everyone with a smile, but there was this quiet intensity about him, like he was holding back something monumental. I tried to stay close to him, hoping that maybe we could at least pretend things were normal, but he kept his distance, barely even looking at me. Meanwhile, Jacob was his usual loud, carefree self, laughing and joking as if he hadn't a care in the world. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, dreading what might happen if John and Jacob ended up in the same conversation. John eventually walked over to the cluster of friends that Jacob was surrounded by at any given time, and I tensed. I got the feeling that John and Jacob's concentration had shifted to me, and I realized that he had not noticed what was to come his way. And then, with a calm, steady pitch, John was the first to increase, to lower the voices of all the participants. "Jacob," he said, his tone measured and cool, "I think it's time you and I had a real talk. You seem to enjoy throwing little jabs, acting like everything's a joke, but maybe the joke's really on you." The whole group went quiet, everyone exchanging uncertain glances. Jacob looked a little taken aback, but tried to brush it off with a chuckle, saying, "Oh, come on, John, lighten up, man, it's all just good fun." But John wasn't backing down. "Good fun? Really?" he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made everyone listen. "Was it good fun when you decided to have an affair with my wife?" There it was. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. People around us gasped, their eyes darting between John, Jacob, and me. I wanted to disappear, to vanish from that spot and pretend this wasn't happening, but there was no escaping it. John had just laid everything bare for everyone to see. He called Jacob to error, who, unsuspecting, tried in vain to make light of the situation, but John was not done. He proceeded to say the things that followed and never betrayed his true feelings throughout that conversation, as his voice remained low, beyond calm, almost eerily silent. "You really fancy yourself someone important, don't you?" he said, staring Jacob right in the eyes. "You really believe that you can walk in on someone's marriage and disrupt it and call the shots like it is some kind of game? But let me tell you something that impressed me more than anything, and which, to be honest, says a lot more about you than it does about me." The crowd was dead silent, every single person watching the scene unfold like something out of a movie. Jacob just stood there, looking like a deer caught in headlights, unable to come up with a response. And then John turned to me, his gaze so cold and piercing that I could barely meet his eyes. "And Anna," he said, his voice softer but no less cutting, "I trusted you. I gave you my love, my loyalty, and this is how you repay me? By sneaking around, lying to me, and humiliating me in front of our friends?" Remorse was suffocating. I could literally feel a heavy burden on top of the heart. It was agonizing to breathe. Still, there was calling for a word, an apology, a justification, but there was nothing to say and no excuse to make it right. The people around me were murmuring, noting the change in my life, and they were right. I was now worse than any criminal out there. I was extremely vulnerable, extremely conscious of the gaze of the strangers all around me, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt lonelier than I had ever felt before, as everything I had considered to be secure seemed to have been forcefully pulled out from under me. After a long, tense silence, John turned back to the crowd, addressing them calmly. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this," he said, his voice steady. "But I think it's only fair that you know the truth. I deserve better than this, and I won't stay in a marriage where respect and trust don't exist." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the midst of shocked murmurs and sidelong glances. My face burned with shame as I looked around, seeing the judgment in everyone's eyes, knowing they were all thinking the same thing, that I was the one who had betrayed him, who had thrown away everything for a fling. It seems like people began to gossip right after the event began. It would be little pieces of conversations flowing around the attendees. "You won't believe what he said. She has the nerve to do this. How sad for John, he wasn't deserving of this. Alone have been lonely, but isolated like that. My dear friends was like I have never been in my life. I was no longer the fellow, no longer one of them. I was an outcast, and they only tolerated me as one to be pitied or despised, and even this state could not be changed." When I finally managed to leave, my heart pounding, I found John waiting for me at home, his expression unreadable. I tried to apologize, to explain, but he held up a hand, stopping me cold. "There's no point in apologizing now, Anna," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I don't want your excuses. I just want my dignity back." He looked at me, his face a mixture of hurt and resignation. "I've decided, Anna," he continued, his voice unyielding. "I can't stay in a marriage where I'm disrespected, where trust doesn't exist. I deserve someone who values me, who respects me, and who doesn't think so little of our vows. So I'm leaving." Those words cut through me like a knife. I felt a wave of panic rise up, a desperate urge to beg him to stay, to tell him I'd do anything to make it right. But the look in his eyes told me that it was too late. There was a finality there, a resolve that I knew I couldn't change, no matter how much I pleaded. I was left standing there watching him walk away from me, realizing that everything I'd taken for granted, the stability, the love, the security of our marriage was gone. My actions had cost me everything, and there was no one to blame but myself. I had betrayed the one person who'd always been there for me, and now I was left with nothing but the hollow echo of my own mistakes. As the door closed behind him, I felt the weight of my choices settle over me, an unbearable realization that the life I'd known was over. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the knowledge of my own failure. I had lost the love and trust of the man I once thought I'd spend my life with, all for a fleeting moment of excitement, and now I had to live with the consequences. In that moment, standing alone in our empty home, I finally understood the full impact of my actions. I'd thrown away everything that mattered, and there was no going back. The whispers, the judgment, the loss was all my doing, and I had no one to blame but myself. Update. Hello, Reddit. It's Anna again. If you've been following my story, you probably already know where things stand now. I'm here because honestly, I don't have anyone else to turn to. Sitting here alone, the silence of my empty home weighing on me, I can't help but replay everything in my mind. The choices I made, the warnings I brushed aside, the life I so carelessly took for granted, it all feels painfully clear now. Looking back, I can't believe how impulsive I was, how easily I let myself be drawn in by someone like Jacob, thinking it was harmless. I see now how I misjudged John, how I underestimated the strength of his reaction and the depth of his love and respect for our marriage. I thought I understood him, thought he'd forgive me, that he'd get over it. But I was wrong. I see that now. I've spent the last few days trying to make sense of the reality I created for myself. The whispers from the neighbors, the judgment I see in their eyes, it's unbearable, and I deserve every bit of it. I was so foolish, so selfish. I had everything I needed, a stable life with a good, loyal man, and I threw it all away for a thrill that lasted only a moment. Now, I'm left with nothing but regret, and I know that's a burden I'll have to carry on my own. So here I am, sharing my last post, as a kind of final confession, I guess. If I could go back, I'd do things differently. I wish I'd never entertained Jacob's advances, never let myself be blinded by that fleeting excitement. I've learned the hard way that sometimes we don't realize the true value of what we have until it's gone. All I can do now is accept what I've done and try to live with the consequences. I know that I've lost John, and I know that's on me. It's a painful lesson, but I have no one to blame but myself. So to anyone reading this, if you're ever tempted to take something you hold dear for granted, remember my story. Because once it's gone, sometimes there's no going back.